Hi, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone again. Teng Boo from Capital Dynamics. And I hope the last 2 weeks you have not missed me too much. So that's why I'm back this week. The topic this week is going to be interesting. And for some people, maybe shocking. For some, controversial. And for some, or for many, they say it's a long time overdue. It's long overdue. What I'm going to talk about today is, to answer this question, has Japan become a barbaric country? A country that is more like a barbarian? For me, frankly speaking, and as you know me, I speak frankly, I speak openly, and I do my research, I am convinced that Japan has indeed become a barbaric country. Don't turn off your video, don't turn off the computer, listen to me, let me explain to you, right? And please don't forget to like the video, to share the video, because when you share this type of video, you help to create peace in East Asia. And of course, if you have not subscribed, please subscribe to Capital Dynamics YouTube channel, where you get discussions on topics that are very wide-ranging, and all of them with full research, proper research. Okay, let's start. Okay, recently, the new Japanese Prime Minister, Sane Takaichi, made a remark on Taiwan, which China dismissed it as prevarication or very evasive. And China warned the Japanese Prime Minister that, look, you have to retract your comments made in early November 2025. But Takaichi, being very stubborn, refused. And the comments that she made was actually very provocative. Why is that so? Because she is saying that if the PLA attack Taiwan, it will constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. One that will allow Japan to remilitarize. That's scary. Those remarks made by Takaichi is the first Japanese leader since the end of World War II to publicly link a Taiwan contingency with the deployment of Japan's self-defense forces. Why is that worrying? Because in the past, if you read history, Japan has used similar types of excuses to invade many countries in Asia Pacific, most particularly to invade China, especially in 1931 when it started with Manchuria. So for you to understand contemporary Japan, when you go to Hokkaido, when you look at the beautiful scenery, you need to understand Japan before and after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. You see a photo of bonsai, photo of chopsticks, cherry blossoms, green tea, kimono. Where did Japan get all these treasures from? Did Japan pay any royalties? I guess you would have guessed the answer. Bonsai, chopsticks, cherry blossom, green tea, kimono, and a whole list of other things, they all came from China. Of course, Japan did not pay any royalties, and Japan has never even said thank you. Japan before the Meiji Restoration, what was it like? You know, relations between Japan and China stretches for 1,000 plus over years, a long history, and in certain periods, the exchange of political, economic, commercial, religious, and cultural practices between these two Asian countries was very intense. China, being the older state and the much more developed country, passed on to Japan, often through Korea, a long list of technologies, practices, cultural practices, daily practices, ideas, governance. So a long list of these things, including cultivation of rice, writing, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, civil service exam, centralized government models, architecture, clothing, art, literature, music, food, the ramen, the gyoza, all came from China. Urban planning, Kyoto and Nara, the urban planning of Nara and Kyoto are all based on Chang'an or Xi'an at that time. And the long list goes on. There's this book, very interesting book. I strongly recommend it, State Formation Through Emulation, the East Asian Model by Professor Huang Jinghao and Professor David C. Kang. David C. Kang is an American Korean. They wrote in this book at the very beginning. This book began with an observation An observation so obvious that it is usually overlooked by many of you in the audience, or when you visit Japan, when you visit Taiwan, when you visit Korea and Vietnam, you overlook them or you simply take them for granted that Korea, Japan, Vietnam have copied an enormous amount from China. Don't take my word for it. Buy the book, read it for yourself. So intertwined, this other historian, Charles Holcomb, says that so intertwined is the history of China with its neighbors that the early histories of both Korea and Japan would be incomprehensible except as parts of a larger East Asian community. And Keith Taylor, in this impressive history of Vietnam, concluded that Vietnamese history as we know it today could not exist without Chinese history. That's how closely intertwined Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China were a long time ago. Confucianism in Japan, Confucianism together with Buddhism stand as major religious philosophical teaching introduced from China, roughly around the mid-6th century, even before the Tang Dynasty. Confucianism, a distinctly Chinese teaching, spread from the Han Dynasty in China into Korea and then later entered Japan. In many significant respects, Confucianism defines much of the East Asian identity of Japan, especially in relation to philosophical thought and practice. These are not my words, these are the words of the two authors. While there's a religious dimension to Confucianism, its teaching, the ethical part, the epistemological, the metaphysical, the political, and the aesthetic angles are typically understood in relation to the socio-political world of humanity, beginning with the individual and his pursuit or her pursuit of moral and intellectual perfection, the family and its pursuit of harmony and order, and the polity and its pursuit of peace and prosperity throughout all below heaven. In this respect, Confucianism was the circular philosophy operative in the ordinary world of everyday existence throughout Japanese history well into modern times. As often as not, however, Confucius' teachings have become so thoroughly integrated into Japanese culture without being explicitly identified as Confucian that many, whether Japanese or non-Japanese, have naively assumed them simply generic to the Japanese mind and its myriad expressions in history and culture. What these two professors are saying is that many have forgotten that the roots of the Japanese mind, the Japanese culture, the Japanese philosophy were rooted in Confucianism and Buddhism. Diplomatic mission. Prince Shotoku, famous prince who ruled on behalf of Empress Suiko, this is the only empress in Japanese history, was a great promoter of ties with China and was a keen advocate of all things Chinese, from chopsticks to Buddhism. His famous 17-article constitution of 604 CE, remember that was before the Tang Dynasty, was heavily influenced by Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist ideas. And Prince Shotoku also sent official missions to the Sui court. This was during the Sui Dynasty, and then throughout the 7th century. All in all, from 607 to 839 CE, which is during the Tang Dynasty, Japan would send 19 state-sponsored missions. This is not counting the private missions, these are state-sponsored missions. The missions were led by high-rank court officials who would be accompanied by counselors, scholars, monks, artists, doctors, musicians, diviners, scribes, interpreters, and so on. And each embassy would include several hundred people. And you know what? A fact which I had to dig deeper before I could discover it. The important Japanese officials had the expenses paid by the Chinese host. That's how welcoming they were. And tribute was given, tribute not in the sense that you think of it as being condescending, not in that sense. Tribute was between equal parties, was given, and gifts were received in return, especially paintings and books. Artists copied what works they could take home as reference works. Musicians paid for lessons from famous teachers, and scholars, typically monks, would study under celebrated religious masters. Japanese doctors acquired the arts of acupuncture, moxibustion, massage, and exorcism. Japanese students would spend longer time in China and not return with the main mission. And there were a few who even took the Cao exam later on, not Cao, the ancient Chinese exam, and became recognized as a Chinese scholar. They studied for several years. In most cases, their costs in most cases were also borne by the Chinese government. And those who did take the time to study seriously in China were often rewarded with high positions when they returned to Japan, becoming government officers or head of institutions, such as Nara's University, where Confucian principles were taught, and courses in Chinese literature and law were the most popular. Monks would continue to establish and head their own versions of Buddhism, which became immensely popular. The Sui dynasty and the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907, that's the Tang dynasty, together with the Sui dynasty, at their peak, deeply impressed China's neighbors, particularly Korea and Japan. Japan imitated the imperial model of the Sui and Tang dynasty, and to whatever degree adopted the Chinese written language, adopted the Sui Tang political institutions and laws, Confucian ideology, and the Buddhist religion. It was during this era of these two dynasties, Sui is pretty short, Tang was pretty long, where throughout East Asia, which was a community of independent national states sharing a common civilization, took shape in forms that have endured now down to present times. Korea, Japan, Vietnam is still very Confucianist. The influence of Chinese language and writing, Kanji, you will know. Chinese was the first and the only written language known in Japan. Of course, the copyright man. And just to give you a summary of the key influences, from governance and religion to language and fashion and more, China's influence on Japan is undeniable. These social, political, commercial, and cultural exchanges have shaped Japan's identity, leaving a legacy that continued until the Meiji Restoration of about 1868, when, after the predominantly Western biased reforms revealed the true nature of the Japanese. As Lee Kuan Yew, the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, correctly observed in his 1998 memoirs, the civility and the bowings are a thin veneer under which lurks the beast. The civility and the bowings of the Japanese are a thin veneer under which lurks the Japanese beast. This is not from me. This is from Lee Kuan Yew. After the Meiji Restoration, 1879, Japan decided to conquer the Ryukyu Islands. The Ryukyu Islands are actually a kingdom, a civilization of their own, where they have maintained peaceful relationships with China for centuries. 1894, 1895, the First Sino-Japanese War. 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. This war is a war which has been commonly identified as the first war where an Asian power defeated a European power. Factually, that's wrong. The first war where Asian power defeated a European power was when Koxinga in Taiwan defeated the Dutch in Taiwan. 1910, Japan annexed Korea and colonized Korea. 1914 to 1918, Japan entered World War I. 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria under false excuses. It was a war that was purposely created by Japan so that they have an excuse to invade Manchuria. 1937, Second Sino-Japanese War. 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because the Japanese military, the military faction in the Japanese government wanted to dominate East Asia all the way to Hawaii. And of course, 1942 to 1945, the military invasion in Southeast Asia. For those of you who have parents, or you have talked to your parents who have gone through this, you would know how horrible it was. My parents used to tell me, and my mother, at that time she was about 17 years old, 16, 17 years old. She told us that she had to dress herself as a boy. She cannot be seen as a young lady because the fear of a young lady being raped were very high. So she has to dress like a young man. Now before that, let me just summarize what Japan is like after the Meiji Restoration. All these conquests that I pointed out to you just now, from the Ryukyu Islands to 1945 World War II, all these invasions, all these military conquests, they were all unprovoked. There was no reason for Japan to go and conquer all these countries. They were all unprovoked. They were all driven by Japan's greed, gluttony, arrogance, and insatiable desire to compete with the Western imperial powers. In becoming westernized, the Meiji Restoration westernized Japan and became drunk with military power because they were industrialized. The Meiji Restoration decimated the long-held peaceful values of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism in Japan and replaced all these pacifist, very peaceful values with Western notions of colonialism and imperialism. With these Western values imbued Meiji Restoration, Japan quickly became a barbaric country, truly barbaric. Before the Meiji Restoration, Japan was able, for a large part of the 1,500 years, able to exist peacefully with all of her Asian neighbors. Let me go back to Lee Kuan Yew and share with you some wonderful quotations that he has. Many others who did not know the new rules of etiquette and did not bow to Japanese sentries at crossroads or bridges were made to kneel for hours in the sun, holding a heavy boulder over their heads until their arms gave way. I had begun to understand that brutalization was part of the Japanese military system, inculcated through regular beatings for minor infringements. The Japanese admitted killing 6,000 young Chinese in that Sukching massacre of 18 February 1942. After the war, a committee of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Singapore exhumed many mass graves in Siglap, Punggol, and Changi. These are all still quotations from Lee Kuan Yew's book. It is estimated that the number massacred to be between 50,000 and 100,000 Singaporeans. Later on, in an interview that I heard, which I was watching on YouTube, I heard for myself Lee Kuan Yew saying that 150,000 Singaporean Chinese who were not armed were massacred by the Japanese. I did not then know that the Japanese government had kidnapped and coerced Korean, Chinese, and Filipino women to cater to the needs of the Japanese troops at the war front in China and Southeast Asia. They also made some Dutch women serve Japanese officers. These are the comfort women, which up to now, Japan still refused to admit that they have committed the crimes. They also showed, they meaning the Japanese, also showed a meanness and viciousness towards their enemies equal to the Huns. If you do not know who the Huns are, please read up and see how cruel they are. Genghis Khan and his hosts could not have been more merciless than these Japanese soldiers. Let me repeat this. I've seen the true nature of the Japanese in and out of prison. The civility and the bowings of the Japanese are a thin veneer under which lurks the Japanese beast. This is during Second World War. And of course, if you want, you can buy the book by Iris Chang, The Rape of Nanking, where she took a lot of trouble to get the evidence that the Nanking massacre happened and 300,000 people, children, women, civilians were killed by the Japanese. Until now, the Japanese refuse to admit all these atrocities. Until now. If you look at the history textbook of Japan, there's only a little footnote that refers to this type of massacres. Little footnote. Again, let me repeat a quotation from the two professors in their book, State Formation Through Emulation. As well as overlooking the fact that state formation in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam had occurred 1,000 years earlier than in Europe, the well-known narrative of state formation in Europe often ignores that it occurred in East Asia for reasons of emulation, not bellicist competition. These countries, meaning the East Asian countries, did not engage in state building in order to wage war or suppress revolt. In fact, war was relatively rare, and there was no such thing as a balance of power system with regular existential threats. Let me continue. Neither war nor preparations for war were the cause or effect of state formation in Korea, Japan, or Vietnam, unlike Europe. Europe is forever fighting one another. Europe had a system called the Westphalian system. That's the Westphalian Treaty, which I think was signed in 1644, 1648, where the European countries decided, oh, let's stop fighting, let's stop the 100-year war, the 30-year war, and let this peacefully. That's 1640 something. Now it's 2025, Europe is still at war. So what you have in East Asia was emulation. So in East Asia, emulation of China, which was the hegemon, which had a civilizational influence across the known world, drove the rapid formation of centralized, bureaucratically administered territorial governments in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. This harmonious development in East Asia completely changed after the Meiji Restoration, where Japan became a Western type of industrial colonial power. After the Meiji Restoration for Westernized Japan, at that time, the Japanese believed that they were superior to the rest of the Asians. They looked down on the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and so on, because they believed that they are the white Asians. So for Westernized Japan, war made the state, and then the state made more war. If it survived, the state was even more state-like and even more warlike. That describes Japan remarkably. This is from the two authors. I wholeheartedly believe that China is right and justified in presently taking such a strong action against the words and the actions of Prime Minister Sane Takaichi, because the words and the actions are very warlike. I firmly believe that every country, not just China, must prevent the return of Japan's militancy. Should that happen, Lee Kuan Yew will turn in his grave should this be allowed to be repeated. There's no doubt in my mind, the evidence shows clearly that since 1868, since the Meiji Restoration, Japan has become a barbaric country. For more than 1,500 years, Japan learned and copied from the rich, advanced, and successful Chinese civilization, the most powerful for a very long time. Japanese missions were always welcome in China, whichever is the dynasty. The only time Japan was attacked, within quotation mark, by over thousands of years, was attacked by China over thousands of years, was during the rule of the Mongols, Kublai and Genghis Khan, who both has already successfully conquered China. So the Yuan dynasty, which is Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan, tried to invade Japan, failed. That was the only time in over 1,500 years. Other than that, the most powerful hegemon in the world was happy to help Japan in any way. Japan did not pay any royalties or say the word of thanks to China. In return for all this benevolence and generous sharing and assistance lasting centuries, without a single provocation, Imperial Japan attacked and invaded China, not once, but many times. I'm sure you agree that such a country can only be compared with a barbarian. Prime Minister Sane Takaichi should have taken the belated but gracious step of officially apologizing to China and the Chinese people and the millions of other Asians too for all the crimes and brutalities that Japan has so cruelly and unnecessarily inflicted on them. Until then, I believe that one should boycott going to Japan. Stop going to Japan. Stop eating Japanese food. Stop buying Japanese products. Why? The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Think carefully what I say. You may not like what I say, you may disagree, but what I ask you to do is to think, ponder, contemplate, and whether what I'm asking you to do makes sense. Otherwise, like what the saying here says, the triumph of evil is for good people like you and me not to do anything. That indeed will be very sad. I hope you enjoy and learn from this video of mine, and please give your comments as usual. I hope you have a good weekend ahead, and we'll see you again next Saturday. Bye-bye.